We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel. Under the gray light of a West Virginia winter morning, the mountains around Preston Hollow seemed to hold their breath. On January 9, 1998, snow had fallen for 3 straight days, coating the steep roads and pine-covered ridges in a silence so complete that even the crows stopped calling. At 6:42 a.m., the night nurse at Valley Ridge Recovery Center, a low-budget methadone clinic outside the mining town of Grafton, signed out her last patient for the morning medication line. His name was Caleb Ward, 32 years old, 5'11", and 6 months into his 3rd attempt at sobriety. Caleb was known around town as a man who tried to get clean, tried to rebuild trust, tried to make it through another winter without slipping back into the hell that had followed him since the mines closed and oxycodone flooded the valley. At 7:15 a.m., he walked out of the clinic into the snowfall, his denim jacket zipped to the throat, a small paper cup of orange juice in one hand, and his take-home dose of methadone in the other. By 8 a.m., he was gone, his tracks leading down the narrow access road toward Route 219, and then disappearing altogether inside a snow tunnel carved by county plows. Those were the last footprints anyone in Preston Hollow would ever see of Caleb Ward. The disappearance might have gone unnoticed longer if not for the clinic's strict attendance rules. Patients were required to check in daily, and when Caleb failed to appear the next morning, the nurse called his emergency contact, his younger sister, Rebecca Ward, a grocery store cashier who lived 15 miles away in Kingwood. Rebecca drove through a storm that locals would later describe as biblical, arriving at the clinic just before noon. She found Caleb's pickup still in the parking lot, its windshield buried beneath 6 inches of snow, keys still in the ignition, thermos still half full on the passenger seat. The clinic's staff assumed he'd gone for a walk, maybe to clear his head, maybe to visit someone in town. But Rebecca knew better. Caleb didn't walk anywhere in the cold. After losing part of 2 fingers in a mining accident and developing frostbite scars on both ears, he avoided the outdoors in winter whenever possible. When the Preston County Sheriff's Office dispatched a deputy that afternoon, visibility had dropped to less than 50 feet. The deputy's report would later note, no signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence suggesting foul play. What he didn't mention was the feeling that stuck with him long after, the strange stillness of the air in that narrow mountain hollow, the way the wind seemed to carry faint echoes of movement where none existed. By dusk, the snowplows had reburied the access road and Caleb's trail was gone. Rebecca's calls to the sheriff's department over the next few days went largely unanswered. The deputies were overwhelmed with road closures and storm damage. The assumption, spoken quietly but firmly, was that Caleb had relapsed, wandered off into the woods, and succumbed to exposure. It was a narrative that fit too easily with local prejudices about addiction. In a town where nearly every family had lost someone to opioids, sympathy had turned to fatigue years ago. Another addict missing. That wasn't news. That was Tuesday. But Rebecca refused to let the story end that way. She organized small search parties of family and friends, volunteers who combed the frozen hillsides and drainage ditches for any sign of her brother. They found nothing, no footprints beyond the snow tunnel, no clothing, no dropped belongings. The only anomaly was a small cluster of cigarette butts near the tunnel entrance, unfiltered hand rolls that Caleb never smoked. Investigators bagged them, but without DNA testing capability in 1998, they were logged and forgotten. The case went cold within 3 weeks, and by spring, the sheriff's office had moved on. For the next 2 decades, Caleb Ward existed only in the form of yellowed flyers pinned to bulletin boards at gas stations and diners. Rebecca never married. She kept his old work boots by the door of her trailer, convinced that he might still come home. In 2005, when the county built a new clinic on the site of the old one, she watched from across the highway as bulldozers scraped away the remnants of the building where her brother had last been seen. Beneath the mud and melted snow, she thought she could still hear him calling. The official narrative hardened over time. A recovering addict, unstable, wandered into the woods and froze to death. No body, no evidence, no closure. It wasn't until January 2018, exactly 20 years after Caleb's disappearance, that a young forensic technician named Dr. Hannah Klein reopened the file while digitizing old casework for the state police. The cigarette butts from the snow tunnel had been stored in a sealed evidence bag, remarkably well preserved. New testing methods allowed analysts to extract trace DNA from the saliva residue on the filters. When the results came back, the genetic profile was a match, not to Caleb Ward, but to Deputy Thomas Rayburn, the very officer who had written the original missing persons report. Rayburn had retired in 2012 after 28 years on the force, spending his final years as a security consultant for the same rehab chain that operated Valley Ridge. He lived quietly in Morgantown, collecting his pension and attending church on Sundays. When confronted with the DNA results in 2018, he claimed the cigarettes were his, left behind accidentally during the initial search. But Dr. Klein's review of the chain of custody raised questions. The evidence bag containing the cigarettes had been logged 2 days after Rayburn's field report, suggesting they'd been collected later, perhaps during a follow-up visit to the site that Rayburn never mentioned. Detective Mark Denning, the state's cold case specialist, took over the reopened investigation. Denning was a stoic man shaped by years of grim work in Appalachia's forgotten corners, coal towns where poverty and addiction intertwined like roots beneath frozen ground. He began reconstructing the timeline from the ground up, interviewing surviving clinic staff, cross-referencing shift schedules, and revisiting weather records from January 1998. What emerged was a pattern of small but significant inconsistencies. The nurse who'd signed Caleb out that morning, Donna Lee McGrath, had always maintained that Caleb was calm and sober. But Denning discovered that Donna had been placed on administrative leave 2 weeks later for mishandling patient medication doses. Rumors at the time suggested she'd been stealing methadone for personal use. Her personnel file also revealed that she'd been romantically involved with Deputy Rayburn, a relationship they'd kept quiet to avoid scrutiny. When Denning tracked Donna down in 2018, she was living in a halfway house outside Charleston, her health destroyed by years of addiction. During their interview, she broke down within minutes, describing the clinic's final days before its closure. "Tom came by a lot back then," she whispered. "Not just to check on us. He said he wanted to help Caleb, but there was something else in his eyes that morning. Something mean." She insisted she'd seen Rayburn's patrol truck parked near the snow tunnel that same morning, long after he was supposed to have left for another call. Denning's review of archived dispatch logs confirmed that Rayburn had never checked in after leaving the clinic at 8:30 a.m. His next recorded radio call didn't occur until 10:12, roughly the same time Rebecca was discovering Caleb's abandoned truck. The gap, 1 hour and 40 minutes, became the center of the renewed investigation. In February 2018, forensic teams excavated the area surrounding the old clinic's foundation, now part of a state storage yard. Beneath 6 feet of frozen soil, they discovered fragments of a wool jacket zipper, a broken metal bracelet, and several small bones later identified through mitochondrial DNA as belonging to Caleb Ward. The remains were incomplete, only part of the right arm and shoulder, but enough to confirm identity. The pathologists noted unusual trace residues on the bones consistent with industrial cleaning solvent, the kind used by maintenance crews to sterilize facilities. When confronted with the findings, Rayburn denied involvement, insisting he'd been framed or that evidence had been contaminated. But Denning's team located a retired janitor from the Valley Ridge facility, who remembered seeing the deputy alone in the boiler room that afternoon, near a storage drain later found to contain the same solvent traces as those on Caleb's remains. As winter melted into spring, the town that had forgotten Caleb Ward was forced to remember. News crews from Charleston descended on Preston Hollow, broadcasting images of the snow tunnel and the crumbling foundation where the clinic once stood. Locals who had long dismissed Caleb as another casualty of the opioid epidemic began speaking in hushed tones at diners and gas pumps, wondering how many other missing people had been buried under years of indifference. Rebecca Ward stood outside the sheriff's department the day the arrest warrant was announced. Snow flurries drifted down, catching in her gray hair as she clutched a photo of Caleb smiling on his 29th birthday. "They said he walked away," she told reporters, her voice steady. "But he didn't walk anywhere. Somebody took him, and now I know who." In April 2019, Deputy Thomas Rayburn was arrested at his home in Morgantown and charged with second-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering. The indictment described a confrontation inside the clinic's maintenance area, likely fueled by Caleb's refusal to act as an informant in a small-town drug diversion scheme that had ensnared several local officials. The motive, as reconstructed through witness testimony, and sorrow, but something steadier, a rhythm beneath the frost, the pulse of a truth too deep to freeze. And somewhere beneath the white silence of another Appalachian winter, the story of Caleb Ward remained, no longer buried, no longer forgotten, simply resting, waiting for the next thaw to remind the living what justice sounds like when spoken through snow. By 2030, Preston Hollow had changed, though not in the way outsiders imagined. The roads were newly paved. The old mining warehouse had been converted into a treatment and recovery center called the Ward House. And for the first time in decades, the high school graduation rate crept above 80%. But for those who remembered what the snow once covered, the progress felt fragile, like ice too thin to trust. Every winter still brought memories with it. Every storm still sounded like footsteps vanishing into wind. The state's official inquiry into the Valley Ridge Network concluded that at least 9 individuals, 5 deputies, 2 contractors, and 2 private distributors had participated in falsifying medication shipments between 1994 and 2001. 2 were already dead. 3 stood trial and 4 cooperated in exchange for leniency. Their testimonies painted a picture so banal it was almost worse than monstrous. Small-town men skimming money from government programs, convincing themselves it was harmless until the lies stacked high enough to crush human lives underneath. Caleb Ward's death, they admitted, had been an accident of conscience, the price of silence maintained too long. When the final verdicts were read in Charleston's federal courthouse in March 2031, Rebecca attended wearing her father's old denim jacket. She didn't stay for the press conference. Justice, she knew, never arrived all at once. It leaked slowly, like snowmelt through rock. Still, as she stepped outside into the weak spring light, she felt something she hadn't in years. A release. Not peace, not closure, but a loosening of the grip that grief had held around her lungs for nearly 3 decades. She drove home through the valley, windows cracked to the damp air, the radio off. For the first time, silence didn't feel haunted. Detective Mark Denning had not lived to see the verdict. He passed the previous autumn, quietly in his sleep. At his funeral, Dr. Hannah Klein delivered the eulogy to a room full of detectives, journalists, and townsfolk. She told them about his first visit to her lab, how he'd stood over the microscope and muttered, "If truth has a body, it's made of dust." She told them he'd never stopped believing that answers existed, even when everyone else called the case cursed. After the service, she placed his worn field notebook into Rebecca's hands. Inside were hundreds of pages, sketches of crime scenes, stray observations, half-formed theories. But at the very end, in Denning's uneven handwriting, one final line: "The cold never wins. It just waits for someone brave enough to stand in it long enough." Rebecca kept the notebook on her bedside table. Some nights she opened it and read until dawn, tracing the pencil marks with her fingers, as if she could still feel his stubborn patience pressed into the paper. On the first anniversary of his death, she mailed a copy of his final report to the State Archive with a note attached, "For future winters." Dr. Klein continued her work, now leading the Forensic Integrity Project, a federal initiative auditing unsolved disappearances across the Rust Belt. She spent her days in labs and her nights giving lectures about chain of custody ethics and the psychology of institutional blindness. But sometimes when she spoke about the Ward case, her voice faltered, not from fatigue but from reverence. "Science doesn't end stories," she told her students. "It just gives the dead a louder voice." In the summer of 2032, the Ward House held its dedication ceremony. The building that once stored methadone shipments now contained counseling rooms, classrooms, and a memorial wall listing every known victim of the Valley Ridge conspiracy. Rebecca stood beside the ribbon with Dr. Klein, the governor, and a group of former addicts who'd completed the program. Cameras clicked as the governor cut the ribbon. But the real ceremony happened afterward, when the crowd dispersed and Rebecca walked the hall alone. The walls smelled faintly of antiseptic and new paint. She paused before a framed photograph of Caleb taken when he was 19, standing in a winter field, his face turned slightly away from the camera, as if already half lost to time. She whispered, "We built you a place that doesn't disappear when it snows." After the opening, life settled into something resembling routine. The Ward House thrived. Journalists moved on to other stories. But for those who had lived through the storm, the past was never fully dormant. It stirred in the smallest moments. Each December, when the first flurries drifted down the valley, Rebecca would step outside her house and look toward the ridge where the old clinic once stood. The land was quiet now, reclaimed by pine and moss, but the wind still seemed to carry echoes of that Valentine's night long ago, the crunch of boots, the sigh of snow sealing secrets. She learned not to fear it. The sound was no longer a haunting. It was remembrance. That same winter, Dr. Klein received a package with no return address. Inside was a small tape recorder, the old analog kind used by journalists in the 90s. The cassette inside was labeled simply, "For When It Snows Again." She played it in her office after hours. The audio was faint, full of static, but beneath the hiss came a familiar voice. Mark Dennings, recorded years earlier during one of his field interviews. "Every story has weather," he said. "Some are born in rain, others in fire. Ours came with snow. You think you can walk out of it, but it follows you home. Still, maybe that's what truth is, the part of winter that never melts." Klein sat there long after the tape ended, the hum of the machines filling the silence. She didn't cry. Instead, she wrote the line on the whiteboard above her desk. "Every story has weather." It became the project's unofficial motto. By 2033, a new generation had grown up hearing Caleb Ward's name, not as tragedy, but as catalyst. High school students in Preston County wrote essays about accountability and rural justice. College scholarships were established for students studying forensic science. Even the local church that once avoided the subject held an annual vigil each February, candles flickering beneath photographs of those lost to addiction and indifference. The town's children knew the story differently. They knew it as proof that people could vanish and still be found, that snow could bury but not erase. Rebecca turned 60 that year. Her hair was silver, her hands weathered, but her voice, when she spoke at the Ward House anniversary event, was steady as ice. "I used to think closure meant finding out who to blame," she said to the gathered crowd. "But it doesn't. It means refusing to let forgetting win. It means carrying the story through every winter until it belongs to the world, not just to the ones who lived it." Applause filled the hall. Outside, snow began to fall again, fine and steady. Klein looked through the glass doors, watching the flakes drift beneath the streetlights, and thought of Denning's line, "Every story has weather." She imagined him somewhere out there, walking through the dark, satisfied that the footprints he left would not be covered this time. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Rebecca lingered in the hall alone. The heating clicked softly. She stood before Caleb's photograph one last time, tracing the frame with her fingertips. "It's over," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant the case, the grief, or the winter itself. Then she smiled faintly. "No, not over, just thawed." She stepped outside into the quiet street. Snow clung to her coat and melted instantly, drops rolling down like tears she no longer needed to shed. In the distance, the church bell struck 9, the same sound that had marked the night of his disappearance 35 years before. But this time it didn't echo with fear. It sounded like release. Far up on the ridge where pine needles bent under fresh snowfall, a lone deer moved through the trees, its hooves sinking into the soft ground. Wind swept across the valley, erasing its tracks almost as quickly as they formed. The world, Rebecca thought, always rewrites itself. But sometimes, if you look closely, you can still see where the first story was written. She turned back toward town, toward the lights of the Ward House glowing gold against the dark. Behind her, snow continued to fall, gentle, endless, no longer hiding anything at all. And so the story ended where it began, in a winter night in West Virginia, where truth had finally learned how to stand the cold. Preserves what the living forget. As the ceremony ended, snow began to fall again, thin, spiraling flakes drifting down like ash. Cameras flashed, capturing images that would appear on newspaper covers across the country. Rebecca didn't look at them. She walked to the edge of the clearing where the forest began and watched the snow swallow the footprints of the crowd one by one until only hers remained. She whispered to the air, "You're found now, Caleb, and so are they." That night, back in her trailer, she lit a candle beside the window and opened the letter Rayburn had written years before. The ink had faded, but the line that once haunted her now felt strangely at peace. "You deserve the truth." She folded it carefully, placed it in a box beside the lighter, and closed the lid. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the sound of snow scraping against tin roofs, a familiar rhythm that had once meant fear, but now meant remembrance. And somewhere beyond the frozen hills, beneath layers of ice and years, the bones of Preston Hollow finally rested, their story told at last. By 2026, the case that began with a missing methadone patient had reshaped West Virginia's criminal justice system. Legislators called it reform. Survivors called it penance. New oversight committees inspected every addiction clinic from Wheeling to Bluefield. Old sheriffs were forced into retirement, records were digitized, and small-town deputies who once buried evidence beneath paperwork now faced scrutiny that no snowstorm could erase. Yet, even as policies changed, Preston Hollow itself seemed trapped between decades, a place caught in a permanent thaw, unsure whether to move forward or sink back into the comforting freeze of silence. The memorial garden grew into a pilgrimage site. Each winter, people from across Appalachia came to leave trinkets and photos along the stone path. Rebecca visited often, never during ceremonies. She preferred quiet mornings when frost rimed the grass and fog clung low to the ground. The bronze plaque had begun to dull, its engraved words fading under constant exposure, but she didn't mind. "Things should fade," she told Denning one morning as he joined her on the bench near the oak tree. "It means they were real." Denning, now officially retired for good, sipped coffee from a metal thermos and said nothing. His joints ached from years of hiking through mountains and case files alike. The silence between them felt earned, not empty. Denning's legacy had become mythologized by younger detectives who joined the newly formed Appalachian Cold Case Division. They called him the man who dug through winter. His methods, rechecking old DNA, reconstructing chain of custody histories, interviewing forgotten witnesses, became procedural templates. Yet for every solved file, there remained another lost in bureaucracy, another family without closure. Denning kept a private list of these names in a notebook he never showed anyone. "Justice is arithmetic," he'd once said to Dr. Klein. "You never get to zero. You just keep subtracting wrongs until you run out of time." Dr. Klein's lab in Charleston became the nerve center of the new forensic era. It was there, in a sterile room humming with sequencers and centrifuges, that she began analyzing what came to be known as the Harker residue cases, hundreds of soil and material samples from across rural West Virginia and western Pennsylvania. Some connected to Valley Ridge, others to unrelated disappearances. Her team identified microtraces of industrial solvent in 5 separate unsolved homicides dating between 1993 and 2001, suggesting a pattern far beyond Rayburn and Harker. Whether they were part of the same network or imitators inspired by rumor, no one could say. One night in late 2026, as snow hammered Charleston, Klein received an anonymous email from a server in Tennessee. It contained a scanned page from what appeared to be an old maintenance log, stamped property of Allegheny Health Systems and dated 1995. Scribbled in the margin was a name she recognized instantly, R. Harker. Beneath it, another unfamiliar one, G. Trower. The page referenced equipment shipments routed through Valley Ridge and 3 other rural clinics. Klein cross-referenced the name Trower and found records of a former logistics manager who had died in 2004, officially of an accidental overdose. The handwriting on the form, however, matched documents signed by Rayburn himself. When Klein showed the discovery to Denning, he frowned. "They were moving product through clinics," he said. "Not just stealing doses. Full-scale distribution hidden inside medical shipments." The implication was horrifying. The corruption that killed Caleb Ward might have been one spoke in a much larger wheel, one that had kept spinning long after the snow melted. In the years since the trial, Rayburn had remained in Huttonsville Correctional Center, declining all interview requests. But after learning of the new evidence, Denning requested one final meeting. In January 2027, he and Klein traveled to the facility. The warden led them to a visitation room that smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee. Rayburn was thinner, his hair gone to white, but his eyes retained their old confidence. "You finally believe me?" he said as they sat. "I told her in that letter you only ever saw one layer." Denning placed the document on the table. "Who was Trower?" Rayburn smiled faintly. "A ghost like the rest of us. The man who kept the snow falling." The interview yielded little beyond cryptic remarks. Rayburn spoke of supply routes, pharmacy audits, and deputies who knew when to look away. But the specifics were buried beneath riddles. You dig too deep, he warned, leaning forward. The frost doesn't like to be broken. Every time you think you've reached ground, you find another winter underneath. When Denning pressed him about Caleb Ward, Rayburn's composure cracked. He wasn't supposed to die, he whispered. He just wouldn't stop asking questions. That boy thought truth could melt anything. The words lingered like frostbite. 2 months later, Rayburn was found dead in his cell, an apparent heart attack during the night. In his locker, guards discovered a folded sheet of paper listing coordinates written in shaky handwriting. The locations corresponded to rural storage yards and maintenance facilities across 3 states. Investigators searched them one by one. Most yielded nothing but rusted tools and dust. But at the final site, near Parkersburg, they unearthed dozens of sealed evidence boxes marked Clinic Archives, 1994-1998. Inside were prescription logs, falsified shipment manifests, and letters between local law enforcement officials and a private pharmaceutical distributor. The corruption wasn't isolated. It had been systemic, stretching far beyond one deputy and his accomplice. For Denning, the discovery felt less like vindication and more like confirmation of something he had always feared, that evil rarely hides in shadows, it hides in paperwork. He wrote a final report before retiring for the last time. Its closing line became famous among investigators. Justice doesn't live in courts. It lives in persistence, in the refusal to let snow settle on the same ground twice. Rebecca read about Rayburn's death in the newspaper while eating breakfast. She felt nothing resembling relief, only a quiet exhaustion. She visited the memorial garden that evening, the wind sharp and dry. "You see?" she murmured to Caleb's name etched in stone. "It never ends. But at least people are still looking." She didn't notice the camera lens trained from across the street, an independent filmmaker capturing footage for a follow-up documentary titled The Winter That Wouldn't End. The documentary aired later that year, focusing not on the crimes but on what followed, the generations shaped by silence. Interviews featured social workers, recovering addicts, and former deputies who confessed to looking away. Its closing scene showed Rebecca sitting at her kitchen table, light flickering across her face as she said, "They called it a cold case, but cold doesn't mean dead. Cold just means waiting." The film's broadcast reignited public empathy for rural addiction crises, leading to new funding for treatment programs. Yet Rebecca avoided watching it. She'd lived the story once. She didn't need to see it dramatized. As winter returned in early 2028, Preston Hollow seemed almost normal again. Children sledded down the same hill where news crews once stood. The grocery store played holiday music over crackling speakers. But the mountains never forgot. Every thaw revealed some relic. An old clinic ID badge washed up in a creek. A rusted methadone bottle unearthed by frost. Locals stopped being shocked. "The past just keeps surfacing," one resident said. "Like the snow spitting back what we tried to bury." Rebecca spent that Christmas alone, save for a visit from Dr. Klein, who stopped by on her way to a forensic conference. They sat by the window, watching sleet trace patterns down the glass. "You ever think it's over?" Klein asked. Rebecca shook her head. "No, but maybe it doesn't have to be. Maybe remembering is enough." When Klein left, she handed Rebecca a small envelope. Inside was a thin plastic vial containing a sample tag marked Sample 04A, Caleb Ward Residue, 1998. "They were disposing of old evidence for storage," Klein explained. "I thought you should have this. It's all that's left that still carries his name." Rebecca placed it beside the lighter and letter, her private altar to persistence. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the valley until the world looked untouched again. From the ridge above town, the wind moaned through the pines in a pitch that sounded almost like a voice. Some said it was the storm returning. Others said it was the dead breathing through the cold. Rebecca listened from her porch, eyes closed, hearing naught. Persistent, like a heartbeat under ice. She spoke aloud, though no one was there to hear. "They thought they could bury you in winter," she said softly. "But the earth remembers warmth." As she stood, snow began to fall again, light and drifting. Across the valley, the wind carried the faint sound of a church bell, followed by the crackle of distant radio static, law enforcement chatter on a new investigation. Another missing person, another storm. Rebecca closed her eyes, the words of Detective Denning echoing in her mind. "Justice doesn't melt the snow. It learns to move through it." And somewhere, far below that frozen soil, the story of Preston Hollow continued to thaw. By winter 2024, Preston Hollow had learned to live with its notoriety. What had once been a quiet mining valley tucked between icy ridgelines had become a case study for every criminal justice symposium and true crime conference in the country. College students wrote dissertations about the Methadone murders, and state auditors picked through old financial ledgers, hoping to find where morality had gone missing alongside the addicts the town forgot. For Rebecca Ward, fame had become its own kind of isolation. She no longer answered journalists. She stopped watching documentaries about her brother. She kept the television on low volume, tuned to weather reports, storms, temperatures, road closures, because she trusted meteorology more than people. The weather didn't lie. It just arrived uninvited, inevitable, and brutal. That February marked 26 years since Caleb's disappearance. The anniversary passed quietly, but not without new ghosts. In Morgantown, construction workers renovating an abandoned state storage building unearthed a sealed metal drum buried beneath a loading dock. Inside were bones, rags, and a corroded nameplate from a hospital gurney. The press latched on to the discovery instantly. Local headlines read, "Another cold case emerges from Valley Ridge shadows." DNA testing later confirmed the remains belonged to Elliot Granger, the same maintenance contractor whose name had appeared on the 1996 solvent receipts. Granger had vanished that same year, officially listed as having moved out of state. Forensic examination revealed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull and chemical erosion consistent with the same industrial cleaner found on Caleb Ward's remains. The implications were staggering. If Rayburn had killed Granger, why bury him instead of disposing of the body the same way as Caleb? And if Rayburn hadn't acted alone, who was the second hand on the shovel? Denning, once again coaxed from semi-retirement, returned to the valley to assist investigators. His face had aged sharply, white stubble, hollowed eyes, but his focus was surgical. He visited the excavation site on a snow-slick morning, notebook in one gloved hand, thermos in the other. The air was so cold it burned to inhale. As technicians cataloged evidence, Denning crouched beside the drum and traced its rust pattern with his fingertips. "This isn't a burial," he murmured to Dr. Klein, who'd come to oversee forensic recovery. "This is containment." Someone didn't want him gone. They wanted him sealed away. When the medical examiner completed her report, the cause of death was ruled homicide. Embedded in the fractured bone was a tiny shard of glass, curved and clear, a fragment from an ampule used to store morphine sulfate. That discovery tied the case not only to Valley Ridge, but to a larger network of drug diversion that stretched across 3 counties during the late 1990s. Pharmacy records showed hundreds of missing units of injectable opioids, all logged as disposed due to contamination, signed off by Rayburn and a second supervisor, Richard Harker. Tracking down Harker after 24 years proved nearly impossible. He'd left Pennsylvania in 2002 and resurfaced briefly under an alias working construction in North Carolina. When Denning requested cooperation from the state police, the trail ended at a rural storage facility outside Asheville where Harker had rented a unit under the name R. Haynes. Inside, authorities found old maintenance tools, a police badge, and a single box of photographs, grainy Polaroids of snow-covered fields, vehicles half buried in drifts, and what appeared to be clinic rooms lit by fluorescent glare. Most disturbing were the close-up shots. Plastic name tags, gloved hands, blurred faces of patients mid-conversation. None of the images were dated, but one bore a note scribbled on its back. "He talked too much." Federal agents seized the storage unit and requested joint jurisdiction, but Denning insisted on finishing what he'd started. "This began in my snow," he told them. "It'll end here." He returned to West Virginia with copies of the photos and began cross-referencing patient lists from 1994 through 1998. Within weeks, 3 more missing individuals matched the unidentified faces in the photographs. 2 were confirmed deceased, overdose victims buried without autopsy. The third, a woman named Angela McKee, had vanished from a neighboring county in early 1997 after entering a detox program affiliated with Valley Ridge. Her case had been closed as voluntary disappearance. The state reopened McKee's file, and Dr. Klein's team began reviewing archival soil samples from the Valley Ridge grounds. Among the trace findings were degraded fibers matching McKee's known clothing and a ring with an engraved AM recovered from a drainage culvert 50 yards from the original excavation site. For Rebecca, each discovery was a wound reopened. The more names emerged, the less unique Caleb's tragedy became. "They were all him," she told Denning one afternoon as they stood outside the temporary morgue trailer, breath clouding in the air. All the people no one looked for because they weren't the right kind of missing. National attention returned like a second blizzard. Preston Hollow, once ashamed of its addiction crisis, now wore it as a badge of penance. The town council approved funding for a memorial garden near the old clinic site, a place to honor victims of institutional neglect. Some residents protested, arguing it would attract dark tourism. Others saw it as necessary reckoning. The groundbreaking ceremony took place in March, the ground still frozen. Rebecca shoveled the first scoop of dirt, her hands trembling not from cold but from the weight of memory. Meanwhile, investigators in Charleston built a comprehensive case file against Harker, connecting him to multiple disappearances and at least 2 confirmed murders. But he remained missing. The last credible sighting came from a gas station clerk in Boone, North Carolina, who remembered an older man with a limp buying road maps and bottled water during a snowstorm in late 2023. Surveillance footage showed him driving away in a rusted pickup with West Virginia plates, a faint grin visible beneath a gray beard. When Denning watched the footage, he paused it frame by frame. "That's not a man running from justice," he said softly. "That's a man revisiting it." The search extended into the Appalachian highlands. Helicopters scouted ridgelines, cadaver dogs combed forests, and digital forensics units traced old radio frequencies once used by county deputies. Then, in early 2025, a park ranger near Monongahela National Forest reported a collapsed hunting shack deep in the timberline. Beneath it lay a shallow grave containing skeletal remains wrapped in a decaying deputy's jacket. Dental records confirmed the identity: Richard Harker, age 71. Cause of death: gunshot wound under the chin. Next to the body, wrapped in oilcloth, investigators found a cassette tape labeled February 1998. The recording, degraded by time but still audible, contained a conversation between 2 men. One voice belonged unmistakably to Rayburn. The second, hoarse and deliberate, matched Harker. The tape captured fragments of their argument the morning of Caleb Ward's disappearance. "Rayburn: He's gonna talk, Rich." Harker: "Then make him quiet. We've done worse." Rayburn: "Not like this. The storm's bad. People'll notice." Harker: "Snow buries everything." "You said that yourself." The final minute contained muffled thuds, a door creak, then silence. Experts later determined the recording had been made using a handheld dictation recorder, likely by Granger, the maintenance contractor later found in the barrel. The revelation tied every thread together. Rayburn and Harker had run a narcotics diversion scheme, using patients as mules for surplus pharmaceuticals. When Caleb uncovered their operation and threatened to expose it, they silenced him, then killed Granger when he attempted blackmail. Forensic confirmation of Harker's suicide closed the final chapter of the investigation, but not its echo. The state issued a report naming systemic negligence and corruption as causal factors in at least 7 deaths and disappearances. The governor addressed the findings publicly, promising reform and funding for rural addiction recovery oversight. His words were careful, political, but hollow. Preston Hollow's residents didn't need speeches. They needed quiet and maybe forgiveness. The memorial garden opened that spring beneath a sky the color of pewter. Rows of granite stones lined the path, each etched with a name, some verified, some only presumed. At the center stood a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "For those who vanished in winter, and for those who refused to stop looking." Rebecca placed Caleb's St. Christopher medal beneath it, letting it rest against the cold metal. Dr. Klein attended, standing beside Denning near the back of the crowd. Neither spoke for several minutes. "You ever wonder why it always starts in winter?" she asked finally. Denning shrugged. "Because that's when everything slows down enough for evil to move unseen." She nodded, eyes on the mountains. "Or maybe because the cold." Pines, a sound that might have been memory or might have been the mountain exhaling the secret it had held for too long. When the snow finally melted in Preston Hollow that spring, it left behind more than mud and runoff. It exposed layers of a community that had been compacted by decades of denial, resentment, and quiet complicity. The winter of 2020 would be remembered not only for the conviction of Deputy Thomas Rayburn, But for the reckoning that followed, the realization that a town could live with a ghost so long that it began to mistake the haunting for peace. In the months after the trial, the media presence faded. The satellite vans disappeared, and what remained was a silence more suffocating than the storm that had buried Caleb Ward's tracks 22 years earlier. Rebecca Ward became a reluctant public figure. Her phone rang constantly. Reporters, advocacy groups, law students, cold case podcast hosts. Some wanted exclusive interviews. Others wanted validation that justice had been served. She declined most of them. "Justice doesn't have a headline," she told one producer. "It has a face." His face. She still worked her shifts at Miller's grocery, still kept the same dented coffee mug on the counter, still walked the same 3 blocks home every evening past the rusted mining memorial where her father's name was carved among the dead. The townspeople nodded to her now, some awkwardly, some with genuine compassion. Yet behind every polite greeting she sensed the same unease, the fear of what other truths might still lie buried under their own snow. Detective Mark Denning spent that summer finishing paperwork in an office that smelled of old paper and rain-soaked uniforms. He'd been offered promotions, television spots, speaking engagements. He turned them all down. He preferred his small desk and the hum of the fluorescent lights. The Rayburn case had consumed 5 years of his life, and though it brought closure, it also exposed something he couldn't unsee. How bureaucracy and small-town loyalty had conspired to protect a killer for 2 decades. He began revisiting other dormant files, applying the same scrutiny that had cracked open Caleb Ward's disappearance. He found patterns, mishandled evidence, missing witness statements, fingerprint cards misfiled under wrong names. Some cases weren't crimes at all. Others were worse than anyone had imagined. In August 2020, Denning met with Dr. Hannah Klein in Charleston to discuss expanding DNA reviews across unsolved rural cases. Over coffee in a half-empty diner, they spoke of technology as both miracle and mirror, how it could reveal not only who committed crimes, but who had failed to care enough to solve them. Klein's lab had grown since her discovery. The state had granted new funding, citing the Rayburn conviction as proof of modern forensics necessity. Yet she carried her own disquiet. "Science gives answers," she said, stirring her cup, "but it doesn't give meaning. We can prove what happened. We can't explain why people keep choosing to look away." The Preston Hollow doctrine, as it came to be called, emerged from Denning's final report, a set of procedural reforms requiring independent audits of evidence rooms and mandatory cross-jurisdictional reviews of cold cases older than 10 years. It became law in 2021. For small departments across Appalachia, it was a bureaucratic inconvenience. For families like Rebecca's, it was a lifeline. Within 18 months, the policy helped close 4 additional cold cases, each revealing some echo of the same neglect that had doomed Caleb's investigation. But justice, like thaw, is uneven. When the pandemic swept through West Virginia that year, it hit the recovery community hardest. Valley Ridge's replacement facility closed its doors, and methadone patients were left scrambling for treatment miles away. The parallels were not lost on Rebecca. "It always starts the same way," she told a local paper. "A storm, a shortage, an excuse. Then someone disappears." She began volunteering at a harm reduction clinic in Morgantown, filing paperwork, making coffee, listening to stories that sounded too familiar. Sons who didn't come home, sisters who stopped answering calls. She never introduced herself as the woman from the trial, but everyone seemed to know anyway. In late 2021, she received a letter from the state correctional facility where Rayburn was serving his sentence. The envelope was marked for inspection, the handwriting old and deliberate. She almost threw it away, but curiosity overcame revulsion. The letter inside was short. "Rebecca, you deserve the truth, but the truth isn't what you think. Caleb wasn't the first, and I wasn't the only one. There's a file buried in the old records room at Valley Ridge. Drawer 4B, marked as maintenance receipts. You'll find a name that doesn't belong there." T.R. Rebecca took the letter to Denning, who had been retired for 6 months but still answered her calls. He read it twice, lips pressed thin. "It could be manipulation," he warned. "He's got every reason to stir up ghosts." But she saw the flicker in his eyes, the same curiosity that had once driven him through snow and archives. They contacted the property manager of the old Valley Ridge storage site, now half abandoned after the company folded. Inside, amid rusted filing cabinets and collapsed ceiling tiles, they found the drawer. Its label had faded, but the number was clear. 4B. Inside lay brittle papers, mold-stained invoices, and one manila folder out of place. It bore the name Elliot Granger, Equipment Repairs, and a date, February 1996, 2 years before Caleb's disappearance. The receipts listed industrial cleaning solvents identical to those found on Caleb's remains, purchased in unusual quantities by Maintenance Deputy T. Rayburn. But scrawled across the bottom margin in faint pencil were the words, "Work complete. Assist by R. Harker." Denning froze. The name Richard Harker appeared in several unrelated case files from the late 1990s, a former sheriff's deputy who had left the force abruptly in 2000 after internal complaints. He'd moved to Pennsylvania and disappeared from official records. Denning knew the implications immediately. If Rayburn hadn't acted alone, there could be other victims, other missing addicts written off as runaways or overdoses. By autumn 2021, state police had reopened 3 additional cold cases connected to the Valley Ridge facility. Each involved patients who had disappeared during heavy snowstorms, each investigated superficially by deputies under Rayburn's supervision. In one, a 19-year-old woman named Lacey Trent was last seen leaving the clinic in 1996. Her file contained a single page, probable relapse. No follow-up. Dr. Klein's team re-examined preserved evidence from a wallet found near a creek 2 miles away. The DNA traces matched solvent residues identical to those in Caleb's case. News of the discovery reignited national attention. Reporters returned. Headlines screamed, "Second victim in methadone clinic murders." But Rebecca avoided the cameras this time. She watched quietly as investigators dug into the frozen ground behind the old facility, uncovering a shallow grave containing remains consistent with a female of Lacey's age. Denning was on site when they confirmed identification. He wasn't lying, he said almost to himself. He wasn't the only one. The revelation transformed the narrative once more. Rayburn became not a lone predator, but the visible tip of a deeper rot, a network of enablers, supervisors and silent witnesses who'd let vulnerable people vanish because they were poor, addicted, and unimportant. The Department of Justice opened an inquiry into Preston County law enforcement practices from 1990 to 2005. Records showed missing methadone stock, falsified transport logs, and unreported patient deaths. The system had been bleeding from within, and Caleb Ward's disappearance was just where the blood had surfaced. When confronted, Rayburn refused further cooperation. His last statement to the press came through his lawyer. They all wanted to believe in a monster. Monsters make better headlines than institutions. His words, cruel but not entirely wrong, echoed through civic halls and community meetings. In Preston Hollow, church sermons began to mention accountability. The phrase "frozen truth" became shorthand for any long-ignored injustice. For Rebecca, the unearthing of Lacey Trent's grave brought both validation and renewed grief. "He wasn't the only one," she whispered one evening, standing beside Caleb's memorial stone. "But maybe that means he's not alone anymore either." She started compiling a list of names, people who'd vanished between 1994 and 2000. Addicts, transients, anyone last seen near Valley Ridge. She mailed the list to Denning with a note, "You taught me how to look. Don't stop now." By 2023, the state's cold case unit had expanded tenfold, funded by grants that cited the Ward investigation as a model. Dr. Klein became director, her lab now equipped with next-generation sequencing machines capable of extracting DNA from decades-old soil. Denning, coaxed out of retirement, served as consultant for an upcoming federal review of unsolved disappearances linked to rural clinics across Appalachia. He joked that he'd spent his career chasing ghosts, but privately, he admitted that every new lead felt like a conversation with Caleb's memory. In February of that year, 25 years after the snow tunnel swallowed a man whole, Rebecca visited the old site one last time. The land was overgrown now, reclaimed by pine and frostweed. She knelt where the clinic entrance once stood, pressing her gloved hands into the frozen ground. The cold bit through the fabric sharp and clean. Somewhere beneath, chemicals had burned away the traces of what had happened, but not all traces fade. She could still feel it, the pulse of memory, faint but forensic evidence was rooted in greed and fear rather than rage. Rayburn's trial would reveal layers of corruption buried beneath the snow of that long winter, exposing how the very institutions meant to protect people like Caleb had become complicit in their disappearance. 20 years after the footprints ended inside a snow tunnel, justice began to move again, slowly, unevenly, but finally in the right direction. By the time the state of West Virginia versus Thomas Rayburn went to trial in January 2020, Preston Hollow had learned how quickly a community could rewrite its own history. The same people who once muttered that Caleb Ward had brought his disappearance on himself now packed the courthouse gallery each morning, wrapped in scarves and thick coats, whispering to reporters about how kind he'd been, how they'd always believed something darker must have happened. Memory in small towns was selective, shifting with the wind and the seasons. But for Rebecca Ward, every moment since 1998 had remained frozen. The courtroom air smelled of disinfectant and wet wool, the scent of snow melting from boots. She sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, hands clasped around the same St. Christopher medal Caleb had worn on a chain the day he vanished. It had been recovered from the evidence excavation, bent, scarred, but intact. The prosecution's case relied heavily on forensic reconstruction, a puzzle assembled from fragments of bone, soil samples, and 2 decades of paper trails. Dr. Hannah Klein, the young analyst who'd first uncovered the DNA anomaly, took the stand on the 3rd day. She explained how advances in low-template DNA extraction had allowed her team to isolate genetic material from saliva residue on the cigarette butts collected near the snow tunnel. Her testimony was clinical, almost detached, but the words struck the gallery like thunder. The DNA profile matched Rayburn with a probability of 1 in 27 trillion. The defense tried to suggest cross-contamination, old storage, compromised evidence, but Klein's credibility was unshakable. "Those cigarettes were smoked by Deputy Rayburn," she said simply, "and placed at the scene within hours of Caleb Ward's disappearance." The defense strategy leaned on nostalgia and reputation. Rayburn's attorney, a heavyset former prosecutor named Douglas Meeks, painted his client as a decorated lawman scapegoated for the failures of a broken system. "This man spent his life cleaning up the wreckage of other people's addictions," Meeks told the jury. "And now when science offers ambiguity wrapped in jargon, you're asked to believe he's the monster? He isn't the villain here. He's the only one who ever cared enough to look." But the state's witnesses slowly dismantled that image. The retired janitor, Leonard Crenshaw, testified about seeing Rayburn in the clinic basement the afternoon of the disappearance, standing beside an open maintenance drain, sweating despite the cold. Crenshaw's voice trembled as he recalled the deputy's words. Some messes don't need a report. He had thought Rayburn was referring to spilled chemicals. He realized later that it might have meant something else entirely. Then came Donnelly McGrath, frail and pale, her hands shaking as she clutched a styrofoam cup of water. She described how Rayburn had begun visiting the clinic under the guise of conducting welfare checks, but often lingered, watching patients with a peculiar intensity. She spoke of an argument that morning between Rayburn and Caleb, overheard through the thin walls of the medication room. "He told Caleb he knew things that could send him back to jail," she said. "Caleb told him he wasn't afraid anymore." Donna paused, voice breaking. "Tom grabbed my wrist when he saw me listening. Told me to mind my dose logs or I'd end up next to him in the snow." Courtroom gasps rippled like wind through dry leaves. Meeks objected, but the damage was done. The image of a trusted deputy threatening a patient hours before his disappearance hung in the air, heavy as the winter fog outside. Outside the courthouse, satellite vans crowded Main Street, their cables snaking through the slush. True Crime Podcast dissected every testimony in real time, calling it the Methadone mystery of Preston Hollow. Old rumors resurfaced, missing evidence from other cases Rayburn had handled, patients who'd transferred clinics abruptly after disputes with staff, whispers about pills that vanished from lockboxes. The town that had once turned its back on addiction now found itself defined by it. For Detective Mark Denning, the trial was both vindication and burden. He'd spent 3 years unraveling the quiet rot that had seeped through local law enforcement during the 1990s. Favoritism, off-the-books deals, unlogged evidence. His notes filled 10 binders, each page marked with snowflake symbols he used to denote inconsistencies. He took the stand on the 8th day, describing how solvent residues found on Caleb's bones matched industrial-grade disinfectant used in the clinic's boiler drains. He detailed how Rayburn's patrol vehicle GPS logs, recovered from obsolete county tapes, showed unexplained stops near the site that morning. Denning's tone remained calm, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. "This wasn't just neglect," he said quietly. "It was choreography. Every piece placed to make us believe a man walked into a storm and disappeared. He didn't vanish. He was erased." Rayburn himself testified near the end, against his attorney's advice. Age had softened his jawline, but not his defiance. He spoke with the weary confidence of someone used to being believed. "I didn't kill anyone," he insisted. "That boy was trouble from day one. He asked me for help scoring pills, not for mercy." He took off. "You can't blame me for ghosts." Yet his composure faltered when prosecutors displayed photographs of Caleb's recovered remains, the twisted metal bracelet glinting beneath the courtroom lights. "He wore that?" Rayburn muttered, voice barely audible. "I told him to take it off before it got caught on something." The unguarded familiarity in that sentence, the quiet presumption of having been close enough to give such advice, sent a murmur through the jury box. The verdict came after 9 hours of deliberation, guilty on all counts. When the foreperson read the word murder, Rebecca Ward closed her eyes, not in triumph, but in a kind of weary release. Snow was falling outside again, thick and silent, the same way it had 22 winters earlier. Rayburn showed no visible reaction as deputies led him away, but witnesses later said that as he passed the gallery, he turned toward Rebecca briefly, his lips forming words she couldn't quite hear, something that might have been sorry, or might have been finally. After the sentencing, life without parole, Preston Hollow tried to move on, but closure in small towns is a myth. The clinic site was fenced off, then sold to a logistics company that promised to bring jobs back to the valley. The old snow tunnel collapsed during a spring thaw, revealing the rusted skeleton of a plow blade long lost beneath the ice. Locals treated it as a symbol, proof that even buried things eventually rise. Rebecca's life shifted quietly. She kept working at the grocery store, though strangers now recognized her from television. People approached her in parking lots to thank her for not giving up. Some brought stories of their own lost siblings, their own unanswered winters. She listened politely, but her eyes always drifted toward the mountains. "Justice doesn't melt the snow," she told one reporter. "It just keeps it from burying the truth again." Detective Denning filed his final report in June 2020, a 214-page narrative documenting not just the crime, but the culture that had allowed it to fester. His closing paragraph became something of a legend among law enforcement circles. In the end, this case was never about a man disappearing into snow. It was about a system that let snow cover everything until the evidence froze. What thought it wasn't luck, it was persistence. Denning retired a year later, his notes archived in the state cold case library where future detectives studied them like scripture. The following winter, Dr. Klein received a small package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a tarnished silver lighter engraved with the initials CW, recovered from the crime lab's overflow storage. No note, no explanation, just the object, cleaned and polished, as if someone wanted to return it to its rightful place. She forwarded it to Rebecca, who kept it on her kitchen windowsill beside a framed photo of Caleb in his mining helmet. When sunlight caught the lighter's surface, it reflected a thin line of brightness across the room, a reminder of something enduring beneath layers of cold. Years later, the case of Caleb Ward became a standard lecture in criminal justice programs across the country. Professors taught it as a study in forensic persistence, the importance of revisiting assumptions, and the quiet prejudice that can derail investigations when victims don't fit the image of innocence. But outside academia, the story lived on in folklore. The addict who vanished into snow, the deputy who thought he could bury guilt under ice, the sister who refused to stop digging. In 2023, a documentary crew filmed on location, capturing footage of the rebuilt valley, the clinic's former grounds, and interviews with those still haunted by the case. The final scene showed Rebecca standing by the frozen river that cut through Preston Hollow, snowflakes settling on her coat. Her voice, calm but unwavering, narrated the closing words. They said it was just another overdose, just another winter. But every storm leaves footprints. You just have to know where to look before the next one covers them. The camera lingered on her face as the wind rose, carrying the faint echo of a man's laughter through the